Hello crafties, welcome to another video. My name is Infiniti and I am back again with my Sentro knitting machine. I'm going to show you guys how I do my double brim knitted hats on this machine. It's a little bit more advanced than last week's tutorial, but it's not too bad. So we're going to of course need the machine. You're going to want a darning needle. I have the really long one that comes with the machine. You might want to have a 4.5 or 4 millimeter crochet hook on standby in case you drop some stitches, and of course you're going to want your yarn. So today I am working with this Red Heart Super Saver in lavender. I'm going to let it go. I'm working in lavender, and as you can see I have my yarn going around my machine. I had it wrapped 1.5 times, but it kind of slipped off of there. So once I do that so that I can measure my yarn and I don't necessarily need a measuring tape, which, to each their own, If you want to use the measuring tape, measure out 12 to 18 inches, that's cool, but you want to make sure that you have enough yarn definitely for this hat to do some sewing in there. So what I like to do is create a slip knot, and I put it around that white hook that should be in the up position, and I just kind of cinch it. Not too tight, not too loose. And I go about casting on, so that next hook should not be catching any yarn. And then the hook after that catches it, doesn't catch, catches it, doesn't catch, catches it. And I just go about doing that all the way around. Alright. Once I get back to the beginning or to the end of my row, my last needle should not be catching the yarn. I'm going to pop my yarn into my threader here, and I'm going to crank one more time, and I'm going to make sure that this white needle right here is catching my yarn like that. Okay, and before I get to the next stitch, I'm going to put my yarn in my threader down here. Now I personally use this center hole, but you can use whichever one works best for your yarn. And we are going to crank the first 3 to 4 rows very slowly as to not lose any stitches, and so that we can catch any mistakes early on. You'll notice here around your machine that the yarn looks to be cast on in increments of 2. That's really important to take note of, because otherwise you're going to end up with some drop stitches. Alright, we're just going to crank, and I'm holding my machine down, but make sure that either your suction cups are holding your machine to your surface well, and makes it sturdy. I think stable is the word I'm looking for. And make sure you don't hit this button if you do have to hold it. Do not hit that black button. You're going to lose count of your rows, and you're just going to be doing a lot of guesswork, which you don't want to be doing for this technique. Alright, so I have cranked my 4 rows. My white needle is back in the up position. So now I can start cranking at a little bit faster pace. If this is your first project for this machine, you're going to want to continue to crank kind of slow just to make sure that you don't get any kinks or catches in your yarn while you're cranking. I am going to crank up 40 rows, and I will meet you back when I have done that. Alright, so I have officially reached 40 rows. My white needle is in the up position. My row counter says 40, so I'm good. I've already gone down in here, and I have put a metal darning needle onto my tail. So what I like to do for this hat, now 40 rows first of all is my personal preference for a brim on a hat. You can do as many or as few rows as you would like. The reason that I kind of fiddled around and came up with this method is because in the beginning when you're working this machine, sometimes your tension isn't the greatest down here around the edge, and you don't want to leave it exposed. And if you don't have any experience with a crochet hook. Maybe I can zoom in a little bit. If you don't have any experience with crochet, it can be kind of a bother when you get your finished project. So I mean, like, my tension here was fairly okay. Like, it's not too tight, it's not too loose, but it's looser than it would be if I were using a regular set of circulars. So for that reason, I came up with this method. So what I do is I kind of match up these stitches as I unroll it. And that's one thing too, these this bottom edge and the top edge, they do curl up on you on the machine just a little bit, but you can unroll them just as easily. So what I do is I just, like, I don't work into that yarn that's directly on the needle, but maybe like a row or two below it, and I just insert my needle down in there. And essentially what I'm gonna do is start sewing this brim up on this hat. Now the reason I do this now as opposed to later, it's a little less annoying when your hat is already on the loom. And the reason that I work it 1, 2, maybe 3 rows down is so that I don't accidentally slip any stitches off of this machine. Because as I've stated in previous videos, it's kind of a bother to fix these stitches at times. So I'm just taking my time, slowly matching up these stitches and tacking them down. And I do so many stitches at a time, and then I start cranking my machine just to make it easier. I don't have to get up and walk around the machine and all that extra hoopla. So I'm just gonna do that. Alright guys, so I have finished going all the way around my loom, sewing the bottom edge up to that 40th row. This is about, what, 2.5 inches of brim. Like I said, that's my standard unit of measurement for my brims. However, if you want to make yours wider or thinner, you're more than welcome to do so. A good example of how this turns out are actually a couple of the hats that I have posted in my Etsy store right now. Shameless plugging. But yeah, those are prime examples of that, or the rainbow hat that I made for myself over this past winter season. That is something that I just absolutely adored. It worked out very nicely. Alright, so I don't typically cut this string once I've sewn that together. I just kind of drop it down in there in case I need it later. But as you can see, that extra half a time of wrapping this around the machine, it kind of comes in handy. Alright, so now that I am done with that part, I can crank as many rows as I want to. Typically for like a closer fit hat, I would go about cranking about 40 more rows. Typically these hats, I let them measure a total of 100 rows typically. I know I personally like the slouchy look, so that's kind of what I do, but you are more than welcome to crank as many rows as you would like. I'm gonna keep cranking and I will meet you guys back when I am satisfied with the length of this hat. Jesus. Alright. Let's go ahead and... How can I get this? Okay, it's completely in the shot. Okay guys, so I have cranked up to 80 more rows. Like I said, the amount of rows that you crank after doing this brim is up to you. I'm ready to cast this off, so I'm just going to pop my yarn out of my threader. This is about what it looks like. So 80 row hat, your project is going to be almost touching your table. Mine is hovering like an inch above my surface down here. Alright, so I'm going to pop my yarn out of my threader. You're supposed to hold your yarn in the up position, and you're supposed to crank a full row without yarn. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now make sure when you're doing this, one, if you do get a little lazy, if that arm gets a little tired, I do understand. Make sure that these needles going up and around this machine do not catch this tail, because it's going to knit it into your project and it's going to be a nightmare to try to unravel that and fix. I've learned from my mistakes. So like I said, I'm going to hold my yarn in the upper position and make sure it's not draped around my needles, and I'm going to crank. And when I cast off, I stop. I see where my yarn is right here, and I stop a few needles before I get back around to this guy, because it facilitates with the cast off process. So I'm just going to do that real quick. Alright, so I am back almost to the beginning of my row, but like I said, I leave a few stitches still on my machine, and I again go for that good 1.5 time, or you can eyeball it, you know, if you've been doing it for a minute, but I'm gonna go ahead and not be lazy. It bees like that sometimes. And I'm just gonna wrap my yarn around there loosely 1.5 times. I'm gonna hold it, gonna find my scissors, buried alive under my yarn, and I'm just gonna cut that. Alright, so now I want to find my darning needle that's still on my other tail. Yay. Alright, and we are going to go about casting off. So I sometimes will cast off with a metal darning needle. Just because, you know, I can sew with it later. A lot of times though, I use my needle that comes with the machine because it's easier to thread and less likely to drop stitches, and for the tutorial sake of visibility. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually turn the machine itself. This is what I like to do. And I note where my string is coming from, like this tail is coming from. So I know right here, this is where that white needle is hiding. This is the 48th stitch thing right here. I'm going to go into the next stitch. I'm just going to whip like right up under that piece of yarn that's done in there. I don't know if I can zoom and possibly get that in. Awesome. So I was able to zoom and get that. So I'm going to work my needle right up under this stitch that's on these little pegs. So a pro tip on casting off with this machine, and I know I've said it before, you don't want to drop these stitches at all ever. It's horrifying. So what I do is, if I'm going to be casting off like this, I'm going to just like kind of hold down the stitch that's next to it. So if you ever see my hand just resting on these pegs, that is why, because it is impossible for that yarn to pop off of that peg and unravel if you're holding it down. I remember making a lot of just regular hats in the beginning and casting off. It was bad. It was so bad. But yeah, so of course the longer you've been doing this, the quicker you can do it, but I wouldn't recommend doing this too fast. You want to make sure that you're getting all your stitches on right and that everything looks okay. Also, the longer you've been doing it, like I said, I tend to use my darning needle. One, if I can't find my plastic needle, but also because I don't have to rethread another needle just to sew. You can sew with this giant needle that they include with the machine that I prefer to cast off with, but it's a little weird, a little wonky when you're trying to, where's that crank? When you're trying to sew and cinch things. So yeah. Now my crank is on the like exact opposite side of me, so it's a little awkward trying to reach over there and do that. But I'm gonna keep just looping these stitches off, and I'll meet y'all back when I have completely cast off my project. Okay, so I have cast off, and I have run into this incident before, and this piece of advice I'm going to base solely off of my own experience. My last stitch is still in this white needle, and so what I want to do, you can like take this long needle, and this is where this comes in handy, and you can go down in that stitch just to pick it up if you're paranoid about it. And then once you crank, let me turn this back around just a little bit. Once you crank and that needle comes back up at any given point, it's gonna come back up. Okay, then you can just kind of gently take it off of there. So yeah, that happens sometimes. Don't ask me why. I haven't quite figured that one out yet. But in some cases that thing doesn't cast off, and it's a good thing that I did loop back under there because that it had not cast off on its own. So that happens sometimes with certain yarns. Some yarns are catchier than others, so just keep that in mind. So now I'm just gonna sew my hat together. Alright, so I have completely cast off, and this is probably my favorite part of this project, or doing hats and scarves and stuff. When I do my hats, rather. First, I turn my project inside out. Now you're going to notice this curling once you cast off. It does that like it did at the bottom no big deal. I'm going to turn my project inside out. Now this hat is going to fit closer to the skull because it's only, what, 80 rows. So it's going to fit a little bit closer. But what I'm going to do is take my working yarn that's up here, and I am just going to cinch my hat closed. Pulling it snug, not too snug. Some yarns will break on you if you pull them too tight. Some of us heavy-handed people may know that from experience. Not that I'm heavy-handed or anything, you know. Alright, and we're just going to cinch that closed as best we can. And I think that's the beauty of like some of these knitted hats. Like, you can just sew together where it won't close up on its own. Alright, so I've cinched it, and I want to kind of turn it back on the right side to make sure that none of that ugly center is showing through, and it's not. So I'm going to flip it back on the wrong side, and I'm going to snip some of this tail because I know that was a weird way to hold scissors. Don't judge me. I'm just going to go ahead and use a metal darning needle if I can pick it up. And I am going to thread it, and I'm going to use this to finish off my project. Now, you might be wondering why I don't snip this guy. I do snip this string down here, but I don't cut it off all the way until I've sewn my tags on, because I have tags that I put on the edges of my hats, or in the insides of my hats, not necessarily at the edge, but anyway. Okay, so what I do when I sew this, I kind of hold this cinched center as flat as I can, pinching it together, and I insert my needle in one side, I come out the other. But I'm not too quick to completely close this loop, and if need be I use my thumb to hold that loop, and I insert my needle back into that loop to form a sort of loose knot. And I do this twice. Stop it. I do this twice. And this secures my yarn initially. Before I go about sewing the rest of this together. There we go. That's knotted. Now I can go about sewing these little sides together. Use any kind of stitch that you'd like. For sewing, I'm in no way a sewing expert. I think this is called whip stitch. I don't know. I should know. My grandma's a seamstress, but I don't. Alright, and then once I reach the other side and I'm satisfied with how that closed up, and you can of course check it by flipping it on the right side again. That looks pretty good in my opinion. Voila. So I'm just gonna go ahead and I'm gonna knot it on this side too. Now the beautiful thing about working in solid colors, when you get to sewing stuff together, it doesn't look weird and it blends in pretty good. Okay, right up under that stitch, I just kind of knot it together, making a second knot. Right, and then to hide this string, you just kind of want to sew it down into your project, and you can do this any way you'd like. I just go down vertically under these little pearl like loops, so hopefully it's hidden And you can, again, flip it inside out. Make sure you can't see it, and I can't see it on this side, so that's great for me. And I'm gonna go back up, just securing my project because I don't want it to unravel later. That's always one of my biggest fears when I started crafting, was my project coming apart. And so I kind of go overboard when I stitch things together. I also use fray check once I'm done. Going right back into this center. And I actually have my fray check. What do you know? So it comes in a bottle that looks like this. I think my hands are always warm, so I always rub the labels off of it. But it's fabric glue. It's like liquid stitch. It dries clear. A little dab will do you. You don't want too much because it dries hard. Now it does wash and eventually soften, but that's how it works. So now that I'm done, I can snip my yarn. And I'm going to save this last string down here for later because I'm going to sew my tag in later. I'm going to cut it a little shorter. Just need a marker. And yeah, here it is. I hope today's tutorial was helpful for you all. If so, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below, letting me know how I did or what kind of projects you would like to see done in the future. I will do my best to figure them out for you guys. I know I have one queued up for post hiatus, so I'm looking forward to doing that. Don't forget to check out my other social media. I am on pretty much everything except for Snapchat, so there's something out there for everybody if you're interested in updates and pattern releases and stuff I'm planning out. Check it out, especially my blog. I know I tend to be a little more active on my blog after my hiatus starts, so keep a watch out for that. Also, don't forget to check out my Etsy store. There's lots of cool stuff popping up over there as well, and I also have a Teespring merch store, so don't forget to check that out. Everything is linked in my description below. And until next time guys, happy making.